Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Inka Vat. Tensions are heating up again between the Philippines and China in the Spratly Islands as dozens of Chinese vessels swarm Philippine-controlled islands shown here in blue, close to Second Thomas Shoal, and as Chinese military drills are announced to have taken place in the area. Now, around Whitsun Reef alone, the Philippine Coast Guard recorded upward of 130 Chinese maritime militia and Coast Guard vessels over the weekend. You could also see the Chinese vessels lashed together to form a sort of barrier. Now, with me to discuss this are Chen-shen, National Chengchi University Professor of Political Science, Tony Hu, former US Department of Defense Senior Director for China, Taiwan and Mongolia, and Ronan Fu, Academia Sinica Institute of Political Science Assistant Research Fellow. All a very warm welcome to the show today. China looks set to once again try to obstruct a resupply to Philippine troops stationed on a wrecked warship deliberately grounded on Second Thomas Shoal to assert Manila's sovereignty. This time, however, the planned convoy would be undertaken by a coalition of NGOs organized by the Atin Ito Alliance, which is Tagalog for It's Ours. The group's resupply run is intended to bring not just food and medicine to the small contingent living on the Sierra Madre, but also some festive cheer ahead of Christmas. China claims up to 90% of the South China Sea under its historical 10-dash map. These claims were thrown out by an international tribunal in 2016. Second Thomas Shoal lies within Manila's 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone under international law. Despite this, Beijing calls the grounding of the Sierra Madre illegal. Professor Yen, let me come to you first. So in the past, China, as we know, has used military-grade lasers, water cannoning, floating barriers and actual collisions to stop the resupply. Now this time, as we said, Atin Ito is a civilian organization.
Yeah.
How does this change the calculus for Beijing?
Well, I think I'm showing Beijing a way to ease the tension by saying, well, this is December, this is Christmas time, and Philippines is a Catholic country, so this is a time of good tithing. So maybe we will allow them, just like in the Middle East between Israel and Gaza, you have a kind of like a humanitarian corridor at this time before Christmas. But starting from 2024, we will not allow. I think that would be the best solution right now. But since this is a civil society groups, it would be very difficult for China to use to show its muscle to a kind of non-military opponent.
Ronan, how about you? I mean, this Christmas cheer, goodwill, is this something that Beijing will take on board?
Yeah, so it's very hard to predict, but given that it's like a civilian convoy, Beijing is unlikely to do anything crazy. So I actually agree with Professor Yan that actually you are not going to see any escalation being the possible scenario.
So basically what we've been seeing, the swarming of the vessels, the many vessels lashed together to form a physical barrier. This is just deterrence? It's not actually to put anything into action?
Yeah, so I would argue that actually it's possible, this interaction could still lead to some unintended consequences. But given that actually the US and China and the Philippines, three sides, they have no intention to further escalate the tension. So everything that you are going to observe sometimes is just like a part of the play. Yeah.
Tony, you've been monitoring Chinese social media ahead of this planned resupply. What do you see there? What's your assessment?
Those social media, I believe it's for domestic consumption, preparing the people in China that there might be a conflict and it's all Philippines' fault. And I even saw some comments say, we should just take Philippines to the United Nations and get them to back down. The Chinese people doesn't realize that in 2016, the ruling has been there saying, hey, that's Philippines EEZ. Of course, the Chinese people, China wouldn't let their own people know about this. So the Chinese people's comment based on that video, you can tell they're ignorant about this. And I suspect this social media basically is preparing the people within China that in case there's a conflict, it says so, we're on the right side of the law, and we should be doing this, and we should chase Filipinos away.
So basically, that their claim to 90% of the South China Sea, that is a rightful. This is what the social media is saying, that this is a rightful claim, and nobody can overturn that.
That's correct. They use the historic claim, obviously, and they say this is rightfully ours and always been ours, and therefore the UN UNCLOS doesn't apply. Yeah.
Professor Yen, let's bring in the US. So, the US has begun advising the Philippines on fixing how to fix the Sierra Armada, which is basically, we saw there, rusting, is dilapidated, and it could be at risk of sinking, in which case they lose their control over that island. So how far does US support go? I mean, would they accompany, escort Manila on the resupply runs?
First of all, this supply, humanitarian kind of supply before Christmas, is only for, food or water or something? Or do you going to try to supply some kind of things to fix the ship? I don't think so, because the ship has been there for the ship, first of all, is 80 years old, right? And now it's being docked there for, several decades. And I think the best thing for China, for Beijing, will be hoping that the ship just sunk and that one day, there is nothing there. That's the best scenario. So delay will be the best thing for China. The big question is, Tony just mentioned about UNCLOS. Yes, China, can talk about UNCLOS and saying this is different from the tradition, but US has not been in a strong position to criticize China because it itself is not a member of UNCLOS, and also, just a 2 days ago is the 200th anniversary of Monroe Doctrine, and if you look at Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. has claimed, the Western Hemisphere as its sphere of influence. Yes, this is not recognized, internationally, but just like the Chinese netizens, Americans still believe, a lot of Americans still believe that Latin America is part of American sphere of influence. So this is, I think, the irony here between China and U.S. Both sides are aggressive in a way in its foreign policy, and so when one side criticizes the other, nobody has a moral ground.
But is there, Ronan, is there any hypocrisy in the US's position? Yes, it's not party to UNCLOS, but it is the biggest upholder, you could say, of the international law. Similarly, Taiwan itself is not part of the UN system. However, it tries to maintain UN standards.
Yeah, so actually the core of the question is rather whether the U.S. is going to escort the resupply. And my take on this is, despite the fact that the U.S. trying to make it very clear that they're trying to advise the repairing of the Sierra Madre, and also they reaffirm their commitment to the common defense. But I think it's unlikely for them to actually get involved and try to escort the civilian convoy.
And why is that?
Yeah, so the reason is twofold. The number one reason is that actually the U.S. also try to avoid a direct confrontation from the Filipino side. They also want to avoid direct confrontation. So that's the reason why they think they come up with this very, very brilliant idea, civilian convoy, right? So that's very brilliant. And the reason for that is because they try to be affirmative, at the same time trying to avoid possible confrontation. Yeah. So.
Tony, that's a very good point, isn't it? Affirmative action, not negative.
Right. Actually, China is counting on that. China is counting on Philippines and United States trying to avoid direct confrontation. Therefore, they will push the issue. They will have the maritime militia probably blockade anything that approaches it. And it is true. It's doubtful the United States will get directly involved unless Filipinos got hurt.
So the mutual defense treaty is activated.
I would suspect before it gets to that point with Chinese blockade, it is highly likely the United States might offer helicopter support and airborne bring supplies in to avoid any type of direct confrontation. However,
that could also have air maneuvers, intercepts. Is that
true?
Correct?
And it's recently United States and Philippines and Filipinos and Australians have done air patrols together familiarize the area. So I suspect that is one way to avoid the right surface confrontation, but yet still keep the troops alive. But that's only temporary. Eventually, this type of conflict will come to being because China will keep pushing and pushing until one side decides that's far enough. I can't back down anymore. That's my fear because through the years, Chinese has always been recognizing only the hard power, and they use hard power to force the opponent backing down. But at a certain point, Philippines has to stand up for its sovereignty and refuse to back down.
Professor Yan, can you answer the question, what is so significant about Second Thomas Shoal? If China was to gain control of it,
well,
how would that
of
change
course, it's
dynamics?
so close to the Philippines. It's so close to the American naval bases. So in a way, this is almost like just in front, outside your front door, that they will have a grace. If they claim the territorial sea there, and then we'll be able to monitor wherever you're doing.
Tony, would you like to comment?
Well, Mischief Reef is right next to Second Thomas Shoal. It's
which is Chinese control.
Chinese got a humongous base already, so it's already monitoring. The key is it's a domino effect. If Philippines fail to protect that particular little piece of shore, might as well admit to Chinese claim for the rest of the area. So I think it's one of those things that Philippines feels this is symbolic. Militarily, it's insignificant, truly, because Mischief Reef is so much bigger. It's got a huge runway, and it's got a lot of dorms for the militaries, and fuel and weapon storage already there. So it's got a listening post, actually. From the satellite picture, you can see. So I think this is more symbolic for the Filipinos, and the fact that if you cannot protect this little piece of island, not even an island, reef, and then that means you can protect the rest of your South China Sea's claim.
So perhaps Beijing wants to break the will of the Philippines
precisely by taking.
Okay, Ronan, very very briefly, how far do you see China assessing the U.S.'s response in supporting the Philippines and using that as a gauge of the U.S. response to Taiwan? After all, some people have called what China's doing blockading Second Thomas Shoal, and of course we know that they've been practicing blockading Taiwan. Yeah,
so you probably cannot call it a litmus test, but obviously, according to some research in among historians, what they found is that actually countries will look back into history and try to evaluate how a country is being very assertive, being very resolved or not. So it is very likely that China is going to use this as a test to see what the United States can do and how far they want to go to defend the Filipino national interest, and perhaps they also consider that as their national interest, maybe not the very core one, but obviously within the domain of their interest.
Okay. Now, my next guest writes in Foreign Affairs magazine that Asia must be willing to take sides and even, quote, sacrifice blood and treasure to protect themselves from Chinese expansionism. John Lee is a senior fellow at Hudson Institute and a former senior national security advisor to Australian Foreign Minister Julie Bishop. Let's take a look.
The only nations making serious attempts to counter Chinese aggression and expansionism is Japan, is Taiwan and Australia, possibly South Korea into the future, and possibly India into the future. But all the other countries, including all of the Southeast Asian countries, they are in the firing line. They do have disputes and territorial disputes with China, but they are not investing in the sorts of national capabilities and defense capabilities they need to deter the Chinese from continuing to expand outwards.
The Philippines is an interesting example, perhaps, of shifting from being more passive to being perhaps more assertive.
The Philippines is probably the only Southeast Asian country that has moved in that direction. You could argue perhaps Vietnam has moved in that direction, but Vietnam doesn't have any allies. The Philippines has realized that being nice to China doesn't really offer any benefits. If you remember just a few years back, the Filipino regime under Duterte tried to pivot towards China, and what it got in return was actually an even more aggressive China. So it's learned its lesson there. But for a lot of these other countries, they've had decades, really decades after the Vietnam War, where there was no perceived great power threat. So they underinvested in their military forces. They didn't really consider strategic threats or take them seriously. They're now finding themselves in a situation of an advancing China, and there is a real sense of hopelessness there, that there is no point resisting China.
And you've said that the US can do more, should do more about this situation. Can you explain how you think that could happen?
Well, the United States is the key. Not only is it the only country powerful enough to balance against China in the region, but it's the only country with any kind of convening power in a region. But you might have all the convening power that you want. It still takes an act of will by individual countries to want to play their role in some kind of collective deterrence of China. And this is where I think the United States has been more selective about offering both military and economic incentives to countries that are more willing to accept a security burden and to defend their own interests. To give you an example, given that the Philippines has taken this direction where they've given increased and significant access to 4 new bases in the Philippines, the United States should subsequently offer the Philippines a very attractive economic and technological infrastructure package. And that should be replicated throughout the region for those countries willing to help themselves.
And it's interesting that you hold up AUKUS as a new paradigm, as a possible new model.
And AUKUS is the agreement between Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. It's not just about buying submarines. It's a military technology and in this industrial sharing agreement between these 3 countries with a militarized framework, but nevertheless there are civilian and economic elements to it. And a point I make about AUKUS is that this is a paradigm of aligning strategic interests, military interests, economic interests, and technological interests in cooperation, which is not something that has really been done in Asia, even a few years back.
You also said that it was no coincidence the trade agreement signed between Taiwan and the US comes as Taiwan is also stepping up its defense and security.
It doesn't surprise me at all that there has been a lot of progress made in a bilateral economic agreement. And this is what I'm talking about, that those countries that align their strategic interests with each other will increasingly find economic and trade reasons to deepen their cooperation. And conversely, those countries where their strategic interests are diverging from the United States, I think there will be a weakening economic relationship.
Tony, so a couple of points there. John Lee says that Asian countries should put blood and treasure into countering Chinese expansionism, but he also says there's a sense of hopelessness there. He also says that the US could play a role in increasing incentives to these countries. Do you agree with those points?
Sort of. I do believe the countries should unite because China has been trying the hardest to make sure they don't unite. And China has openly stated they like to deal with individual countries separately to come to some kind of joint development agreements with the sovereignty belonging to China. So on the other hand, China also has been very successful within ASEAN preventing ASEAN coming together on the South China Sea issue. So overall, their strategy is working, and I don't think they see any need to change. But Philippines probably should stand together with Vietnam and Malaysia and come together and unite and basically get into hardcore negotiation with China, because individually they will lose.
Professor Yan, now let's move to Taiwan. Taiwan administers Taiping Island, which is also known internationally as Itu Abu, in the South China Sea. It's boosted its numbers, its Coast Guard numbers at the island because of rising tensions. Now, the US has recently sailed past Taiping Island to dispute the claim of Taiwan and China to that atoll. How does Taiwan's stance, how is it seen in the international community? Does it differ? Are they seen different to China?
Well, this is a very difficult and awkward position for Taiwan. At the same time, we are just like the Philippines, just like Vietnam. There is a strong nationalism that we are not going to lose any offshore islands, including, the Taiping Island in the South China Sea. But at the same time, when we claim, we still claim, the South China Sea part of this our, territorial water before. We have never really abandoned that lines. So it would be difficult for Taiwan to give up Taiping, but we also know it's very difficult to defend. So at the same time, we are just trying to maintain presence there to show that we have a will to defend our territory there. So this is the difficult part, even though it's just somewhere too far from Taiwan. It's not like the offshore island of Kinmen and Mazu or even Pescadores. So the resupply will be very difficult. And, we are pretty isolated there. And I don't know how to defend, but you cannot give up any territory, just like, if the Philippines cannot give up the Second Thomas Shoal, we cannot give up Itu Apa.
Ronan, some in Taiwan say the government should be doing more to assert the ROC's claims, not just to Taiping Island, but to the rest of the South China Sea. Let's take a look at what Yen Hui Song says about it.
The question is, what actions have been taken by the government in support of your claims? For example, Scarborough Shoal, Second Thomas Shoal, when China and the Philippines are confronting each other, and you claim that belong to you, but you do nothing, you say nothing. There comes the question of the estoppel, right? Being ignored. When you come to the real discussion and you have the cooperative proposal, and Taiwan will not be invited, including code of conduct discussion right now, right?
I mean, in the ROC constitution, the ROC also lays claim to China, to Tibet, to Mongolia.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yes.
Ronan, so Professor Song there was saying that if Taiwan is not more assertive, then it will be ignored. He used the example of Scarborough Shoal and said that both China and the Philippines were wrangling over this and Taiwan was nowhere to be seen. He said that, for example, there's the code of conduct negotiations and Taiwan doesn't have a seat at the table. So do you agree with Professor Song, or do you think there are reasons why the Taiwan government has not adopted that approach?
Yeah, so basically the Tsai administration really needs to find a fine line between being assertive and trying to maintain regional stability. And I agree with Professor Song that Taiwan can be more vocal in terms of asserting our sovereignty claim and the stand that we are going to take. We can be vocal. But
does that not align Taiwan with the PRC, though?
Yeah, so basically you can make sure that, Taiwan should be abided by, for example, the 2016 award, that's for sure. But Taiwan also needs to make sure that we find a way so that our position do not perfectly align with the PRC. You want to make sure that regional stability is what you want to prioritize, right? So the tricky part is how to work with most of the claimants while not provoking China, and trying to avoid the possible escalation.
Tony, what's your view? Because it's not just the professor mentioned Taiwan against China, but it would be Taiwan against the Philippines, Vietnam, not just China.
Yeah, I think Taiwan needs to make a decision. Is it going to abide with the 2016 decision? However, Taiwan's claim with the Taiping Islands is very solid. Taiwan has been there for literally 6 decades, and with physical presence. And also, it's an island, it's not a shore, it doesn't sink into the water on the high tide. It's not artificial like the ones that China built on top of those shores.
Professor Yan, I mean, are we talking about essentially Taiwan wants to keep hold of Taiping Island, but does it necessarily want to claim Scarborough Island, the rest of the Spratlys?
I'm not sure right now because the traditional claim, if you give up the traditional claim and you claim it, then people say, wow, you're willing to sacrifice territory, even though you don't have control over those reefs or islands or the surrounding waters, but people don't want you to give up something easily.
Has that been tested through a referendum or any sort of polling?
I'm not sure anyone dare to put this one for a vote because in terms of realistically, yeah, it's difficult to supply, but there is always possibility. People say, you have the claim of those waters, and then who knows? There might be minerals underneath. There might be, oil that,
gold.
So something there. So you don't give up, and you don't put it on a referendum. You're going to lose that referendum anyway.
If I may, I would like to
very briefly.
Yeah, very briefly, jumping and just to add that you have to make sure that you make rhetorical presence in those games. So I agree with Professor Yan that you do not claim that you are going to give up, but you do not affirmatively say that, okay, so we own those islands. So you are playing a very, very, very intelligent, try to find a fine line and play the diplomacy very cleverly.
Okay. Well, all, thank you so much
You're
for joining
welcome.
Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching our show today. Stay safe and see you next time.